It's winter in England right now. The stove is lit and the fire is burning brightly. There's a small dog curled up on my lap. And I'm going to read some winter stories to you, specifically ones about Christmas. So if you settle down, close your eyes and listen, I will read to you The Osbornes Christmas by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Cousin Myra had come to spend Christmas at the Firs, and all the junior Osbornes were ready to stand on their heads with delight. Darby, whose real name was Charles, did it, because he was only 8, and at 8 you have no dignity to keep up. The others, being older, couldn't. But the fact of Christmas itself awoke no great enthusiasm in the hearts of the junior Osbornes. Frank voiced their opinion of it the day after Cousin Myra arrived. He was sitting on the table with his hands in his pockets and a cynical sneer on his face. At least Frank flattered himself that it was cynical. He knew that Uncle Edgar was said to wear a cynical sneer, and Frank admired Uncle Edgar very much, and imitated him in every possible way. But to you and me, it would have looked just as it did to Cousin Myra, a very discontented and unbecoming scowl. "I'm awfully glad to see you, Cousin Myra," explained Frank carefully. "And you being here may make some things worthwhile, but Christmas is just a bore, a regular bore." That was what Uncle Edgar called things that didn't interest him, so that Frank felt pretty sure of his word. Nonetheless, he wondered uncomfortably what made Cousin Myra smile so queerly. "Why, how dreadful," she said brightly. "I thought all boys and girls looked upon Christmas as the very best time of year." "Well, we don't," said Frank gloomily. "It's just the same old thing year in, year out. We just know exactly what's going to happen. We even know pretty well what presents we are going to get. And Christmas Day itself is always the same. We'll get up in the morning, and our stockings will be full of things, and half of them we don't want. Then there's dinner. It's always so poky. And all the uncles and aunts come to dinner, just the same old crowd every year, and they say just the same things. Aunt Desda always says, 'Why, Frankie, haven't you grown?' She knows I hate to be called Frankie. And after dinner they'll sit around and talk the rest of the day, and that's all. Yes, I call Christmas a nuisance." "There isn't a single bit of fun in it," said Ida discontentedly. "Not a bit," said the twins, both together, as they always said things. "There's lots of candy," said Darby stoutly. He rather liked Christmas, although he was ashamed to say so before Frank. Cousin Myra smothered another of those queer smiles. "You've had too much Christmas, you Osbornes," she said seriously. "It has palled on your taste, as all good things will if you overdo them. Did you ever try giving Christmas to somebody else?" The Osbornes looked at Cousin Myra doubtfully. They didn't understand. "We always send presents to all our cousins," said Frank hesitatingly. "That's the bore too. They've all got so many things already. There's no end of bother to think of something new." "That isn't what I mean," said Cousin Myra. "How much Christmas do you suppose those little Rowlands down there in the hollow have? Or Sammy Abbott with his lame back? Or French Joe's family over the hill? If you have too much Christmas, why don't you give some to them?" The Osbornes looked at each other. This was a new idea. "How could we do it?" asked Ida. Whereupon they had a consultation. Cousin Myra explained her plan, and the Osbornes grew enthusiastic over it. Even Frank forgot he was supposed to be wearing a cynical sneer. "I move we do it, Osbornes," said he. "If Father and Mother are willing," said Ida. "Won't it be jolly?" exclaimed the twins. "Well, rather," said Darby scornfully. He did not mean to be scornful. He had heard Frank saying the same words in the same tone, and thought it signified approval. Cousin Myra had a talk with Mother and Father Osborne that night, and found them heartily in sympathy with her plans. For the next week the Osbornes were agog with excitement and interest. At first Cousin Myra made the suggestions, but their enthusiasm soon outstripped her, and they thought out things for themselves. Never did a week pass so quickly, and the Osbornes had never had so much fun either. Christmas morning there was not a single present given or received at the Firs, except those which Cousin Myra and Mr. and Mrs. Osborne gave to each other. The junior Osbornes had asked that the money which their parents had planned to spend in presents for them be given to them the week previous, and given it was, without a word. The uncles and aunts arrived in due time, but not with them was the junior Osborne's concern. They were the guests of Mr. and Mrs. Osborne. The junior Osbornes were having a Christmas dinner party of their own. In the small dining room a table was spread, and loaded with good things. Ida and the twins cooked that dinner all by themselves. To be sure, Cousin Myra helped some, and Frank and Darby had stoned all the raisins and helped pull the homemade candy, and all together they had decorated the small dining room royally with Christmas greens. Then their guests came. First, all the little Rowlands from the Hollow arrived, 7 in all, with very red, shiny faces, and not a word to say for themselves, so shy were they. Then came a troop from French Joe's, 4 black-eyed lads who never knew what shyness meant. Frank drove down to the village in the cutter and brought lame Sammy back with him, and soon after the last guest arrived, little Tilly Mather, who was Miss Rankin's orphan asylum girl from over the road. Everybody knew that Miss Rankin never kept Christmas. She did not believe in it, she said, but she did not prevent Tilly from going to the Osbornes' dinner party. Just at first the guests were a little stiff and unsocial, but they soon got acquainted, and so jolly was Cousin Myra, who had her dinner with the children in preference to the grown-ups, and so friendly the junior Osbornes that all stiffness vanished. What a merry dinner it was! What peals of laughter went up, reaching to the big dining room across the hall, where the grown-ups sat in rather solemn state. And how those guests did eat and frankly enjoy the good things before them. How nicely they all behaved, even the French Joes. Myra had secretly been a little dubious about those 4 mischievous-looking lads, but their manners were flawless. Mrs. French Joe had been drilling them for 3 days, ever since they had been invited to the Christmas dinner at the big house. After the merry dinner was over, the junior Osbornes brought in a Christmas tree loaded with presents. They had bought them with the money that Mr. and Mrs. Osborne had meant for their own presents, and a splendid assortment they were. All the French Joe boys got a pair of skates apiece, and Sammy a set of beautiful books, and Tilly was made supremely happy with a big wax doll. Every little Rowland got just what his or her small heart had been longing for. Besides, there were nuts and candies galore. Then Frank hitched up his pony again, but this time into a great pung sleigh, and the junior Osbornes took their guests for a sleigh drive, chaperoned by Myra. It was just dusk when they got back, having driven the Rowlands and French Joes and Sammy and Tilly to their respective homes. This has been the jolliest Christmas I ever spent, said Frank emphatically. I thought we were just going to give the others a good time, but it was they who gave it to us, said Ida. Weren't the French boys jolly? Giggled the twins. Such cute speeches as they could make. Me and Teddy Rowland are going to be chums after this, announced Darby. He's an inch taller than me, but I'm wider. That night, Frank and Ida and Cousin Myra had a little talk after the smaller Osbornes had been haled off to bed. We're not going to stop with Christmas, Cousin Myra, said Frank at the end of it. We're just going to keep on through the year. We've never had such a delightful old Christmas before. You've learned the secret of happiness, said Cousin Myra gently, and the Osbornes understood what she meant. Aunt Cyrilla's Christmas Basket. When Lucy Rose met Aunt Cyrilla coming downstairs, somewhat flushed and breathless from her ascent to the garret with a big, flat-covered basket hanging over her plump arm, she gave a little sigh of despair. Lucy Rose had done her brave best for some years. In fact, ever since she had put up her hair and lengthened her skirts, to break Aunt Cyrilla of the habit of carrying that basket with her every time she went to Pembroke. But Aunt Cyrilla still insisted on taking it, and only laughed at what she called Lucy Rose's finicky notions. Lucy Rose had a horrible, haunting idea that it was extremely provincial for her aunt always to take the big basket, packed full of country good things, whenever she went to visit Edward and Geraldine. Geraldine was so stylish and might think it queer, and then Aunt Cyrilla always would carry it on her arm and give cookies and apples and molasses taffy out of it to every child she encountered, and just as often as not to older folk too. Lucy Rose, when she went to town with Aunt Cyrilla, felt chagrined over this, all of which goes to prove that Lucy was as yet very young and had a great deal to learn in this world. That troublesome worry over what Geraldine would think nerved her to make a protest in this instance. Now, Aunt Cyrilla, she pleaded, you're surely not going to take that funny old basket to Pembroke this time, Christmas Day and all. "'Deed I am, 'deed I am," returned Aunt Cyrilla briskly, as she put it on the table and proceeded to dust it out. "I never went to see Edward and Geraldine since they were married that I didn't take a basket of good things along with me for them and I'm not going to stop now. As for its being Christmas, all the more reason. Edward is always real glad to get some of the old farmhouse goodies. He says they beat city cooking all hollow, and so they do. But it's so countrified, moaned Lucy Rose. Well, I'm countrified, said Aunt Cyrilla firmly, and so are you. And what's more, I don't think that it's anything to be ashamed of. You've got some real silly pride about you, Lucy Rose. You'll grow out of it in time, but just now it's giving you a lot of trouble. The basket is a lot of trouble, said Lucy Rose crossly. You're always mislaying it, or afraid you will, and it does look so funny to be walking through the streets with that big, bulgy basket hanging on your arms. I'm not a mite worried about how it looks, returned Aunt Cyrilla calmly. As for its being a trouble, why, maybe it is. But I have that, and other people have the pleasure of it. Edward and Geraldine don't need it, I know that, but there may be those that will, and if it hurts your feelings to walk alongside a countrified old lady with a countrified basket, why, you can just fall behind, as it were. Aunt Cyrilla nodded and smiled good-humouredly, and Lucy Rose, though she privately held to her own opinion, had to smile too. Now, let me see, said Aunt Cyrilla reflectively, tapping the snowy kitchen table with the point of her plump, dimpled forefinger. What should I take? That big fruit cake for one thing. Edward does like my fruit cake, and that cold boiled tongue for another. Those 3 mince pies too. They'd spoil before we got back, or your uncle would make himself sick eating them. Mince pie is his besetting sin. And that little stone bottle full of cream. Geraldine may carry any amount of style, but I've yet to see her look down on real good country cream, Lucy Rose. And another bottle of my raspberry vinegar. That plate of jelly cookies and doughnuts will please the children and fill up the chinks. And you can bring me that bottle of ice cream candy out of the pantry, and that bag of striped candy sticks your uncle brought home from the corner last night, and apples, of course, 3 or 4 dozen of those good eaters, and a little pot of my green gage preserves. Edward'll like that. And some sandwiches and pound cake for a snack for ourselves. Now, I guess that will do for eatables. The presents for the children can go in on top. There's a doll for Daisy, and the little boat your uncle made for Roy, and a tattered lace handkerchief apiece for the twins, and the crochet hood for the baby. Now, is that all? There's a cold roast chicken in the pantry, said Lucy Rose wickedly. And the pig Uncle Leo killed is hanging up in the porch. Couldn't you put them in too? Aunt Cyrilla smiled broadly. Well, I guess we'll leave the pig alone. But since you have reminded me of it, the chicken may as well go in. I can make room. Lucy Rose, in spite of her prejudices, helped with the packing, and not having been trained under Aunt Cyrilla's eye for nothing, did it very well too, with much clever economy of space. But when Aunt Cyrilla had put in as a finishing touch a big bouquet of pink and white everlastings, and tied the bulging covers down with a firm hand, Lucy Rose stood over the basket and whispered vindictively, "Some day I'm going to burn this basket when I get enough courage. Then there'll be an end to lugging it everywhere we go like a old market woman." Uncle Leopold came in just then, shaking his head dubiously. He was not going to spend Christmas with Edward and Geraldine, and perhaps the prospect of having to cook and eat his Christmas dinner all alone made him pessimistic. "I mistrust you folks won't get to Pembroke tomorrow," he said sagely. "It's going to storm." Aunt Cyrilla did not worry over this. She believed matters of this kind were foreordained, and she slept calmly. But Lucy Rose got up 3 times in the night to see if it were storming, and when she did sleep had horrible nightmares of struggling through blinding snowstorms, dragging Aunt Cyrilla's Christmas basket along with her. It was not snowing in the early morning, and Uncle Leopold drove Aunt Cyrilla and Lucy Rose and the basket to the station 4 miles off. When they reached there, the air was thick with flying flakes. The station master sold them their tickets with a grim face. "If there's any more snow comes, the trains might well keep Christmas too," he said. "There's been so much snow already, the traffic is blocked half the time, and now there ain't no place to shovel the snow off onto." Aunt Cyrilla said that if the train were to get to Pembroke in time for Christmas, it would get there. And she opened her basket and gave the station master and 3 small boys an apple apiece. "That's the beginning," groaned Lucy Rose to herself. When their train came along, Aunt Cyrilla established herself in one seat and her basket in another, and looked beamingly around her at her fellow travellers. These were few in number. A delicate little woman at the end of the car, and a baby and 4 other children. A young girl across the aisle with a pale, pretty face. A sunburned lad 3 seats ahead in a khaki uniform. A very handsome, imposing old lady in a sealskin coat ahead of him, and a young man with spectacles opposite. A minister, reflected Aunt Cyrilla, beginning to classify, who takes better care of other folks' souls than his own body. And that woman in the sealskin is discontented and cross at something. Got up too early to catch the train, maybe. And that young chap must be one of the boys not long out of the hospital. That woman's children look as if they hadn't enjoyed a square meal since they were born. And if that girl across from me has a mother, I'd like to know what the woman means, letting her daughter go from home in this weather, in clothes like that. Lucy Rose merely wondered uncomfortably what the others thought of Aunt Cyrilla's basket. They expected to reach Pembroke that night, but as the day wore on, the storm grew worse. Twice the train had to stop while the train hands dug it out. The third time it could not go on. It was dusk when the conductor came through the train, replying brusquely to the questions of the anxious passengers. A nice lookout for Christmas. No, impossible to go on or back. Track blocked for miles. What's that, madam? No, no station near. Woods for miles. We're here for the night. These storms of late have played a mischief with everything. Oh dear, groaned Lucy Rose. Aunt Cyrilla looked at her basket complacently. At any rate, we won't starve, she said. The pale, pretty girl seemed indifferent. The sealskin lady looked crosser than ever. The khaki boy said, "Just my luck," and two of the children began to cry. Aunt Cyrilla took some apples and striped candy sticks from her basket and carried them to them. She lifted the oldest onto her ample lap and soon had them all round her, laughing and contented. The rest of the travellers straggled over to the corner and drifted into conversation. The khaki boy said it was hard lines not to get home for Christmas after all. I was invalided from South Africa 3 months ago, and I've been in the hospital at Netley ever since. Reached Halifax 3 days ago and telegraphed the old folks I'd eat my Christmas dinner with them and have an extra big turkey because I didn't last year. They'll be badly disappointed. He looked disappointed too. One khaki sleeve hung empty at his side. Aunt Cyrilla passed him an apple. "We were all going down to Grandpa's for Christmas," said the little mother's oldest boy dolefully. "We've never been there before, and it's just too bad." He looked as if he wanted to cry, but thought better of it and bit a mouthful of candy. "Will there be any Santa Claus on the train?" demanded his small sister tearfully. "Jack says there won't." "I guess he'll find you out," said Aunt Cyrilla reassuringly. The pale, pretty girl came up and took the baby from the tired mother. "What a dear little fellow," she said softly. "Are you going home for Christmas too?" asked Aunt Cyrilla. The girl shook her head. "I haven't any home. I'm just a shop girl, out of work at present, and I'm going to Pembroke to look for some." Aunt Cyrilla went to her basket and took out her box of cream candy. "I guess we might as well enjoy ourselves. Let's eat it all up and have a good time. Maybe we'll get down to Pembroke in the morning." The little group grew cheerful as they nibbled, and even the pale girl brightened up. The little mother told Aunt Cyrilla her story aside. She had been long estranged from her family, who had disapproved of her marriage. Her husband had died the previous summer, leaving her in poor circumstances. "Father wrote to me last week and asked me to let bygones be bygones and come home for Christmas. I was so glad, and the children's hearts were set on it. It seems too bad that we are not going to get there. I have to be back at work the morning after Christmas." The khaki boy came up again and shared the candy. He told amusing stories of campaigning in South Africa. The minister came too and listened, and even the sealskin lady turned her head over her shoulder. By and by the children fell asleep, one on Aunt Cyrilla's lap, and one on Lucy Rose's, and two on the seat. Aunt Cyrilla and the pale girl helped the mother to make up beds for them. The minister gave his overcoat, and the sealskin lady came forward with a shawl. "This will do for the baby," she said. "We must get up some Santa Claus for these youngsters," said the khaki boy. "Let's hang their stockings on the wall and fill 'em up best we can. I've nothing about me except some hard cash and a jackknife. I'll give each of them a quarter, and the boy can have the knife." "I've nothing but money either," said the sealskin lady regretfully. Aunt Cyrilla glanced at the little mother. She had fallen asleep with her head against the seat back. "I've got a basket over there," said Aunt Cyrilla firmly, "and I've got some presents in it that I was taking to my nephew's children. I'm going to give 'em to these. As for money, I think the mother is the one for it to go to. She's been telling me her story, and a pitiful one it is. Let's make up a little purse among us for a Christmas present." The idea met with favour. The khaki boy passed his cap and everybody contributed. The sealskin lady put in a crumpled note. When Aunt Cyrilla straightened it out, she saw that it was for $20. Meanwhile, Lucy Rose had brought the basket. She smiled at Aunt Cyrilla as she lugged it down the aisle, and Aunt Cyrilla smiled back. Lucy Rose had never touched that basket of her own accord before. Ray's boat went to Jackie, and Daisy's doll to his older sister. The twins' lace handkerchiefs went to the two smaller girls, and the hood to the baby. Then the stockings were filled up with doughnuts and jelly cookies, and the money was put in the envelope and pinned to the little mother's jacket. "The baby is such a dear little fellow," said the sealskin lady gently. "He looks something like my little son. He died 18 Christmases ago." Aunt Cyrilla put her hand on the lady's kid glove. "So did mine," she said, and the two women smiled tenderly at each other. Afterwards they rested from their labours, and all had what Aunt Cyrilla called a snack of sandwiches and pound cake. The khaki boy said he hadn't tasted anything half so good since he left home. "They don't give us pound cake in South Africa," he said. When morning came, the storm was still raging. The children wakened and went wild with delight over their stockings. The little mother found her envelope and tried to utter thanks and broke down, and nobody knew what to say or do when the conductor fortunately came in and made a diversion by telling them they might as well resign themselves to spending Christmas on the train. "This is serious," said the khaki boy, "when you consider that we've no provisions. Don't mind for myself. Used to half rations or no rations, but these kiddies have tremendous appetites." Then Aunt Cyrilla rose to the occasion. "I've got some emergency rations here," she announced. "There's plenty for all, and we'll have our Christmas dinner, although a cold one. Breakfast first thing. There's a sandwich apiece left, and we must fill up on what's left of the cookies and doughnuts, and save the rest for a real good spread at dinner time. The only thing is, I haven't any bread." "I've a box of soda crackers," said the little mother eagerly. Nobody in that car will ever forget that Christmas. To begin with, after breakfast they had a concert. The khaki boy gave 2 recitations, sang 3 songs, and gave a whistling solo. Lucy Rose gave 3 recitations, and the minister a comic reading. The pale shop girl sang 2 songs. It was agreed that the khaki boy's whistling solo was the best number, and Aunt Cyrilla gave him the bouquet of everlastings as a reward of merit. Then the conductor came in with the cheerful news that the storm was almost over, and he thought the track would be cleared in a few hours. "If we can get to the next station, we'll be all right," he said, The branch joins the main line there, and the tracks will be clear. At noon they had dinner. The train hands were invited to share in it. The minister carved the chicken with the brakeman's jackknife, and the khaki boy cut up the tongue and the mince pies, while the sealskin lady mixed the raspberry vinegar with its due portion of water. Bits of paper served as plates. The train furnished a couple of glasses. A tin pint cup was discovered and given to the children. Aunt Cyrilla and Lucy Rose and the sealskin lady drank turn about from the latter's graduated medicine glass. The shop girl and the little mother shared one of the empty bottles, and the khaki boy, the minister, and the trainman drank out of the other bottle. Everybody declared they had never enjoyed a meal more in their lives. Certainly it was a merry one, and Aunt Cyrilla's cooking was never more appreciated. Indeed, the bones of the chicken and the pot of preserves were all that was left. They could not eat the preserves because they had no spoons, so Aunt Cyrilla gave them to the little mother. When all was over, a hearty vote of thanks was passed to Aunt Cyrilla and her basket. The sealskin lady wanted to know how she made her pound cake, and the khaki boy asked for her recipe for jelly cookies. And when, 2 hours later, the conductor came in and said the snow ploughs had got along and they'd soon be starting, they all wondered if it could really be less than 24 hours since they met. I feel as if I've been campaigning with you all my life, said the khaki boy. At the next station they all parted. The little mother and the children had to take the next train back home. The minister stayed there, and the khaki boy and sealskin lady changed trains. The sealskin lady shook Aunt Cyrilla's hand. She no longer looked discontented or cross. This has been the most pleasant Christmas I have ever spent, she said heartily. I shall never forget that wonderful basket of yours. The little shop girl is going home with me. I've promised her a place at my husband's store. When Aunt Cyrilla and Lucy Rose reached Pembroke, there was nobody to meet them, because everyone had given up expecting them. It was not far from the station to Edward's house, and Aunt Cyrilla elected to walk. I'll carry the basket, said Lucy Rose. Aunt Cyrilla relinquished it with a smile. Lucy Rose smiled too. It's a blessed basket, said the latter, and I love it. Please forget all the silly things I've ever said about it, Aunt Cyrilla. The Joseph's Christmas. The month before Christmas was always the most exciting and mysterious time in the Joseph household. Such scheming and planning, such putting of curly heads together in corners, such counting of small hoards, such hiding and smuggling of things out of sight as went on among the little Josephs. There were a good many of them, and very few of the pennies. Hence the reason for so much contriving and consulting. From 14-year-old Molly down to 4-year-old Lenny, there were 8 small Josephs in all in the little log house on the prairie, so that when each little Joseph wanted to give a Christmas box to each of the other little Josephs, and something to father and mother besides, it is no wonder that they had to cudgel their small brains for ways and means thereof. Father and mother were always discreetly blind and silent through December. No questions were asked, no matter what queer things were done. Many secret trips to the little store at the railway station 2 miles away were ignored, and no little Joseph was called to account because he or she looked terribly guilty when somebody suddenly came into the room. The air was simply charged with secrets. Sister Molly was the grand repository of these. All the little Josephs came to her for advice and assistance. It was Molly who, for troubled small brothers and sisters, did such sums in division as this. How can I get a 10-cent present for Emmy and a 15-cent one for Jimmy out of 18 cents? Or how can 7 sticks of candy be divided among 8 people so that each shall have one? It was Molly who advised regarding the purchase of ribbon and crepe paper. It was Molly who put the finishing touches to most of the little gifts. In short, all through December, Molly was weighed down under the avalanche of responsibility. It speaks volumes for her sagacity and skill that she never got things mixed up or made any such terrible mistake as letting one little Joseph find out what another was going to give him. Dead secrecy was the keystone of all plans and confidences. During this particular December, the planning and contriving had been more difficult and the results less satisfactory than usual. The Josephs were poor at any time, but this winter they were poorer than ever. The crops had failed in the summer, and as a consequence the family were, as Jimmy said, on short commons. But they made the brave best of their small resources, and on Christmas Eve every little Joseph went to bed with a clear conscience, for was there not on the corner table in the kitchen a small mountain of tiny, sometimes very tiny, gifts labelled with the names of recipients and givers, and worth their weight in gold if love and good wishes count for anything. It was beginning to snow when the small Josephs went to bed, and when the big small Josephs climbed the stairs, it was snowing thickly. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph sat before the fire and listened to the wind howling about the house. "I'm glad I'm not driving over the prairie tonight," said Mr. Joseph. "It's quite a storm. I hope it will be fine tomorrow for the children's sake. They've set their hearts on having a sleigh ride, and it will be too bad if they can't have it when it's about all the Christmas they'll have this year. Mary, this is the first Christmas since we came west that we couldn't afford some little extras for them, even if 'twas only a box of nuts and candy." Mrs. Joseph sighed over Jimmy's worn jacket, which she was mending. Then she smiled. "Never mind, John. Things will be better next Christmas, we'll hope. The children will not mind, bless their hearts. Look at all the little knick-knacks they've made for each other. Last week, when I was over at Taunton, Mr. Fisher had his store all gayified up, as Jimmy says, with Christmas presents. I did feel that I'd ask nothing better than to go in and buy all the lovely things I wanted, just for once, and give them to the children tomorrow morning. They've never had anything really nice for Christmas. But there, we've all got each other and good health and spirits, and a Christmas wouldn't be much without those if we had all the presents in the world." Mr. Joseph nodded. "That's so. I don't want to grumble. But I tell you, I did want to get Maggie a real live doll, as she calls it. She never has had anything but homemade dolls, and that small heart of hers is set on a real one. There was one at Fisher's store today, a big beauty with real hair and eyes that opened and shut. Just fancy Maggie's face if she saw such a Christmas box as that tomorrow morning." "Don't let's fancy it," laughed Mrs. Joseph. "It is only aggravating. Talking of candy reminds me that I made a big plateful of taffy for the children today. It's all the Christmassy I could give them. I'll get it out and put it on the table along with the children's presents. That can't be someone at the door." "It is, though," said Mr. Joseph, as he strode to the door and flung it open. Two snowed-up figures were standing on the porch. As they stepped in, the Josephs recognized one of them as Mr. Ralston, a wealthy merchant in a small town 15 miles away. "Late hour for callers, isn't it?" said Mr. Ralston. "The fact is, our horse has about given out, and the storm is so bad that we can't proceed. This is my wife, and we were on our way to spend Christmas with my brother's family at Lindsay. Could you take us in for the night, Mr. Joseph?" "Certainly, and welcome," exclaimed Mr. Joseph heartily. "If you don't mind a shakedown by the kitchen fire for the night. My, Mrs. Ralston," as his wife helped her off with her things, "but you are snowed up. I'll see to putting your horse away, Mr. Ralston. This way, if you please." When the two men came stamping into the house again, Mrs. Ralston and Mrs. Joseph were sitting at the fire, the former with a steaming hot cup of tea in her hands. Mr. Ralston put the big basket he was carrying down on a bench in the corner. "Thought I'd better bring in our Christmas flummery," he said. "You see, Mrs. Joseph, my brother has a big family, so we are taking them a lot of Santa Claus stuff. Mrs. Ralston packed this basket, and goodness knows what she put in it, but she half cleaned out my store. The eyes of the Lindsay youngsters will dance tomorrow, that is, if we ever get there." Mrs. Joseph gave a little sigh in spite of herself, and looked wistfully at the heap of gifts on the corner table. How meagre and small they did look, to be sure, next to that bulging basket with its cover suggestively tied down. Mrs. Ralston looked too. "Santa Claus seems to have visited you already," she said with a smile. The Josephs laughed. "Our Santa Claus is somewhat out of pocket this year," said Mr. Joseph frankly. "Those are the little things that the small folk here have made for each other. They've been a month at it, and I'm always kind of relieved when Christmas is over and there are no more mysterious doings. We're in such cramped quarters here that you can't move without stepping on somebody's secret." A shakedown was spread in the kitchen for the unexpected guests, and presently the Ralstons found themselves alone. Mrs. Ralston went over to the Christmas table and looked at the little gifts, half tenderly and half pityingly. "They're not much like the contents of our basket, are they?" she said as she touched the calendar Jimmy had made for Molly out of cardboard and autumn leaves and grass. "Just what I was thinking," returned her husband. "And I was thinking of something else too. I have a notion that I'd like to see some of the things in our basket right here on this table." "I'd like to see them all," said Mrs. Ralston promptly. "Let's just leave them here, Edward. Roger's family will have plenty of presents without them, and for that matter, we can send them ours when we get back home." "Just as you say," agreed Mr. Ralston. "I like the idea of giving the small folks of this household a rousing good Christmas for once. They're poor, I know, and I dare say pretty well pinched this year like most of the farmers hereabouts after the crop failure. Mrs. Ralston untied the cover of the big basket. Then the two of them, moving as stealthily as if engaged in a burglary, transferred the contents to the table. Mr. Ralston got out a small pencil and a notebook, and by dint of comparing the names attached to the gifts on the table, they managed to divide theirs up pretty evenly among the little Josephs. When all was done, Mrs. Ralston said, "Now, I'm going to spread that tablecloth carelessly over the table. We will be going before daylight, probably, and in the hurry of getting off, I hope that Mr. and Mrs. Joseph will not notice the difference till we're gone." It fell out as Mrs. Ralston had planned. The dawn broke fine and clear over a vast white world. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph were early astir. The breakfast for the storm-stayed travellers was cooked and eaten by lamplight. Then the horse and sleigh were brought to the door, and Mr. Ralston carried out his empty basket. "I expect the trail will be heavy," he said, "but I guess we'll get to Lindsay in time for dinner. Anyway, much obliged for your kindness, Mr. Joseph, and when you and Mrs. Joseph come to town, we will hope to have chance to return it. Goodbye, and Merry Christmas to you all." When Mrs. Joseph went back to the kitchen, her eyes fell on the heaped-up table in the corner. "Why?" she said, and snatched off the cover. One look she gave, and then this funny little mother began to cry. But they were tears of happiness. Mr. Joseph came too, and looked and whistled. There really seemed to be everything on that table that the hearts of children could desire. 3 pairs of skates, a fur cap and collar, a dainty work-basket, a half-dozen gleaming new books, a writing desk, a roll of stuff that looked like a new dress, a pair of fur-topped kid gloves, just Molly's size, and a china cup and saucer. All these were to be seen at first glance, and in one corner of the table was a big box filled with candies and nuts and raisins, and in the other a doll with curling golden hair and brown eyes, dressed in real clothes and with all her wardrobe in a trunk beside her. Pinned to her dress was a leaf from Mr. Ralston's notebook, with Maggie's name written on it. "Well, this is Christmas with a vengeance," said Mr. Joseph. "The children will go wild with delight," said his wife happily. They pretty nearly did when they all came scrambling down the stairs a little later. Such a Christmas had never been known in the Joseph household before. Maggie clasped her doll with shining eyes. Molly looked at the work basket that her housewifely little heart had always longed for. Studious Jimmy beamed over the books, and Ted and Hal whooped with delight over the skates. And as for the big box of good things, why, everybody appreciated that. That Christmas was one to date from in that family. I'm glad to be able to say, too, that even in the heyday of their delight and surprise over their wonderful presents, the little Josephs did not forget to appreciate the gifts they had prepared for each other. Molly thought her calendar just too pretty for anything, and Jimmy was sure the new red mittens which Maggie had knitted for him with her own chubby wee fingers were the very nicest, gayest mittens a boy had ever worn. Mrs. Joseph's taffy was eaten too. Not a scrap of it was left. As Ted said loyally, it was just as good as the candy in the box, and had more chew to it besides. Peaceful slumbers. Sleep sweet.